The history of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, part 1. Let me begin again with just a bit of a preamble. I don't consider myself an expert. I'm not even sure that's what you come to me for. I consider myself someone who's invested, who's given some time, and does their best to go into a situation with an open mind to understand. Oh, of course, I have my biases. A friend of mine texted me the other day and said, "Do you like sports or politics better?" I said sports. There's a lot of deep reasons beyond just bread and circus, beyond just entertainment and escapism. I love the communitarian nature of sports. I love the analogy that sports provides for testing yourself the best we can in civil society, for testing yourself in a way that is only revealed about who you are, answering that question, who you are. That a guy like David Bellavia, again on Monday's episode of the Will Cain Podcast, knows, who has that wisdom. I texted my wife after that conversation. It hadn't even been published yet. I said to my wife, I want my boys to listen to this conversation. And she said, I just listened to it. It's amazing. I'd never want my boys to be in war. And of course, I don't want my boys to be in war. But I want for them what I don't have and never will have. And that is that wisdom, that knowledge, not just of man, but of self. I don't know about myself what a man like David Bellavia knows, not just about man, but what he knows about himself. You know, all I want is to try to understand who we are, who I am, what we're doing here, what is our purpose. And I know that when I come to you today, I'm just a person like you who's trying to get some history, to find the beginning. So I thought what I'd do as I've gathered all this information is break this up into 3 parts. We won't do long 1.5 hour, 1 hour conversations on the history of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. We're going to break it up into 3 parts. Today I'm going to talk to you about essentially 1880 through about 1920. What I'm going to talk to you about is the beginning of Zionism through the end of World War I, with a quick, deeper dive into ancient history. Again, I'm always welcome to your feedback, Will Cain Podcast at fox.com. And consider this like a Cliff's Notes of this history. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict for dummies of the Will Cain Podcast. You can go deeper, and you should go deeper if you want deeper understanding, if your curiosity demands. There are many great resources, obviously. Ongoing treaties, books written. I never know exactly who I can go to that doesn't already have their mind made up, or who's not giving me one side of a conflict, or who's not leading me in a certain direction. But there are many that I've found that I think have given me a well-rounded basis, skeleton, framework for this history. One of those, even though he's been accused of being Islamophobic and or anti-Semitic, is Daryl Cooper of the Martyr Made podcast. Absolutely deep, 30 hours of research, I think, very fairly, looking into the history of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Between that and the depth of reading that I've managed to try to cram in to try to understand this moment in time, here's what I would share about the beginnings of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Let's start with the concept of original history, of stolen land, of who belongs in the Holy Land. I reject the concept, as you know very well, I reject the concept of stolen land. I don't accept that it is a useful concept. None of us are born from the ether or grow from the ground like the grass. We are all the product of conquest, and conquest is the nature of humankind. We take game, resources, and land from fellow man to advance our tribe. That is what has been done from the beginning of history. It has been done violently. It has been done peacefully. It has been done deceptively. It has been done through diplomatic negotiations, through the man-made creation of state. But it has been done repetitively. The Pilgrims took the land from the East Coast Indians. The pioneers took the land from the Plains Indians. The Plains Indians took the land from their ancestors and other tribes who stood there in South Dakota before them. Those quote-unquote Native Americans took the land as they came over the Bering Straits and the land bridge from Asia. Every peoples took land from a previous people. I reject the idea and the concept of stolen land. So when we look back in history and say, who does this belong to? Does it belong to the Palestinians? Does it belong to the Jews? The truth is, it doesn't belong to anyone any more so than the winner of a war gets to write history. That's not to produce you or push you or inspire you into this nihilistic vision of the world of winner takes all. But it is a fact of history that really the rightful claimant to land is the winner of the battle for that land. Jews go back in the Middle East thousands and thousands of years. You know it from the Old Testament. You know it from your Bible. You have King Saul, King David. You have Jewish kingdoms that were situated in Canaan. You have Jewish, it would be hard to say empires because of the scope and scale and geographic breadth of any particular tribal empire of that time. We're talking about thousands of years BC. But Jewish history deep in the Middle East. Of course, you also had many other tribes. As time progressed, you had Christians and Druze and Arabs, all scattered throughout the land that is referred to as the Holy Land. All right there in a fairly small geographic area. Today encompasses modern Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. But come the period of time right after the birth of Christ, the Romans Empire, which extended pretty much over what Western civilization considers the known world at that time, the Romans had decided that they'd had enough of the tribes of King David, the descendants of the tribes of King David, the Jews. The Romans had decided that there was enough difficulty administering law, there is enough difficulty in maintaining order, that they simply went in and destroyed Jerusalem. You know, a lot of this interaction between the Jews and the Romans is laid out for you in what is a really awesome television series called The Chosen. You can go back in that time, and it's well acted, well written. When it's really hard to go back on any particular piece of fiction or dramatization, rather, and see quality storytelling where a modern human can project themselves into that time period. Because, I mean, you know, they wore different clothes, they spoke different languages, they wore different styles, they had different customs. It's just hard. It's hard to project yourself. It's hard to identify. That's what you need in a story. You need to see yourself. You need to see your story in someone else's story. But it's really well done, and it's brought up to standards where you, as a modern American, used to scrolling 30-second increments on TikTok or 90-minute movies on Netflix, will enjoy The Chosen. But the Romans go into Jerusalem and destroy the civilization of the Jews, scatter them to the winds. Jews essentially, virtually run out of the Holy Land. And the Jewish diaspora is spread then for the next 2,000 years all across, not just Europe, because you had Jews in Iran, you still had some in the Middle East, but primarily throughout Europe. Jewish neighborhoods, ghettos, villages, populations living in Paris and London and Berlin. Of course, we're even predating those modern urban centers. We're talking about, you know, even predating Germany, the concept of the nation state of Germany or France. You're talking about tribes of Jews settling among tribes of Celts and tribes of, you know, Gaelics or Gaels and the various Anglo-Saxon tribes of Germany. But as well, a lot settling in what we then later would come to call Russia. Jews all over that area. Still a very, very, very small population. Even today, you know, Jews make up only something like 1 or 2% of the total global, I think it's 1% of the total global population. But while Jews were spread out across that entire existence, that entire geographic landmass, they all had something similar to experience, and that was anti-Semitism. Now, I don't have the expertise, the knowledge, or the time to explain the roots of anti-Semitism, but it clearly is a reality of history. Jews, in wherever they lived, in Germany or France or Russia, began to experience, or did experience, not began to, but experienced throughout millennia, what's called a pogrom. You know, pogroms were these moments where whatever tensions existed between tribal rivalries erupted into horrific spats of violence. If you were a Jewish family living in Russia in, I don't know, 1500, it could in a moment's notice be the case that your neighbors and your police or whoever it is that lived in your society, all of a sudden before you know it, were turning on you, and your wife was raped and your children were murdered, and you had pogroms where thousands were killed, thousands in one setting, one civilizational setting, one village, one town, one area of Russia or Europe, and it was often conducted by Christians. It was not at the hands of what we think of as a thousands of year old blood feud between Muslims and Jews. No, this was happening at the hands of Christians or pagans, but it was happening. No matter where you lived as a Jew, this was happening. Pogroms were part of your life. And if you want to know what a pogrom looked like, a modern day version of the pogrom is just exactly what happened in southern Israel. Just that type of barbarism, that type of random killing, that bloodlust, that spilling over of just the base humanity. That's what it was. It was a pogrom. So Jews across essentially was, I say the globe, but the known world at that time of the globe of, advanced civilization in the West, were experiencing that. And they didn't just experience it a little. They experienced it for hundreds and thousands of years. And you can imagine how that was baked into their not just their identity, but their DNA. Always wary, always aware, always fearful. Every time you locked your door, no matter what you did, no matter how you lived, skeptical, knowing what happened to your grandfather, what the stories you were told, what happened to the people that moved here from where they moved from. So by the time we get to the 1800s and the 1880s, there began to be a movement afoot in Europe called Zionism. Zionism was the idea the Jews would return to a safe place where they could live together in protection from these types of pogroms that were happening in places like Russia. And Zionism had many founders, but the main founder was a guy named Theodor Herzl. Now, Herzl was, I believe, a Hungarian. He was an Eastern European writer, journalist. And he began this idea. He really pioneered. He championed this idea that the Jews should find a place. And in the beginning, there was like little discussion about where. Should they go to the Americas? Should they go to Argentina? Should they section some cordon off some area of Russia? But I mean, there was almost sideshows because really, ultimately, everyone knew the historical claim. I mean, it's in Jewish prayers. It's in song, Return to Jerusalem. So there was a connection, obviously. But there really had been no Jews, of any significance in the Middle East by the time you get to the 1880s for 2,000 years after the Romans ran the Jews out of Jerusalem. So the modern Zionist movement began in the 1880s, and it identified the Middle East, or identified what would later be termed Israel, as the place to begin a migration. And it wasn't like it happened, well, in the grand scope of history, it happened in the blink of an eye. But it didn't happen in the blink of an eye when we're just taking a scope of history from 1880 to present. It took years. And it wasn't necessarily a political movement in the beginning. What I mean, it wasn't like, we're going to move to the Middle East, we're going to set up a state, and we're going to call it Israel. It was actually just like really the actual definition of colonization. We're going to go, we're going to live together, we're going to share our customs, we're going to protect one another. We're going to be together in a place of our ancestry. There's cultural Zionism, there's religious Zionism, and there's many other forms of Zionism, including political Zionism. But in the beginning, it wasn't really an overt idea to set up a state. to pursue political Zionism. Now, if you think about it, I've talked about on this podcast the idea of tribes, and I'm fascinated by the idea of tribes. It's the ultimate human survival mechanism. It's our base level of organization beyond the family. And it's common to every culture. It's common to every human civilization. I mean, I'm Scotch-Irish. A lot of people in the South and Texas and places like that are. Those are the people that pushed west in America. And, my ancestors living in whatever it may have been, the Highlands of Scotland or Northern England or, Ireland or Northern Ireland, we had clans. What was a clan but a tribe? Extended family that organizes themselves in mechanisms of protection and societal organization. That's what Native American tribes were. And within those tribes, as exemplified best with Native Americans, you can develop different customs and languages and so forth. But human beings as tribal is in our DNA. Daryl Cooper in that podcast, it's called Fear and Loathing, the Martyr Made podcast, the series is called Fear and Loathing, talks about the tribe is actually completely anachronistic to the nation state. Like, tribe is in our blood. Tribe is in our DNA. Tribe is not hard to understand. But nations are an idea. There have been those, within conservative spheres who have said America is not just an idea, it's a people. And I'm sympathetic to that. And I want to think more about that because I reject the idea there's not a culture of America. But America is an idea like every nation's an idea. It's all an idea. If you think about the idea of the nation state, whether we're talking about Israel or the United States or the United Kingdom or France or Germany, that's a relatively recent phenomenon in human history. I mean, we're talking about 200-ish years. I mean, there wasn't really even such a thing as Germany until the late 1880s or late 1800s. It's a new phenomenon in human history to get us to buy into an idea of commonality for self-protection or defense or conquest for resources, whatever, for empire building. We didn't organize ourselves in terms of nations. And that really wasn't the idea of the United States of America. Yes, we had a loose confederation where we were going to come together for common defense, and a constitution consecrated all this, right? But we were going to be reductionist in terms of the normal development of human civilization. Not tribal, but smaller states. Why? You have more influence on states. You have, a greater voice in a legislature. And even from states, then you empower even local municipalities, local governments. Why? Again, in turn, more power to honor the way you want to live, your community, your family, your clan, your tribe, your people want to live. That was the idea of the United States. Even this idea of the nation state of the United States really didn't take form until after the Civil War. And even then, at that, if you look at the late 1800s in the United States of America, it would resemble nothing like what you think of the United States of America today. That's really, when I say a modern creation, that's a creation. I'm sure World War I was a great leap forward in that. World War II, yet another. And then it's off to the races after FDR and World War II, where we begin to replace our identity as Texans or Virginians with Americans. It's a blip on the radar of humanity, on the timeline of humanity. It's new. And anything that new, by the way, is worth asking, will it last? I definitely believe that. Like, don't take for granted. We're such prisoners of our moment and when we live. It's like everything that exists now, the future is only a bigger version of that, or it is exactly like it is today. It's the problem with climate change. It's the problem with climate change arguments. It's the problem with innovation. It's the problem with everything. You think that the future is some version of the present, but it's not. It can't be. It never has been. And in fact, if you want real wisdom on what the future looks like, look into the past. What lasted forever? And what lasted forever was tribes. And in this, you have got to take a moment. We all have to take a moment and say, look at the tribe of Judaism. Amazing. 1% of the global population, scattered across the globe, right? Believe it or not, tribes disappear. Cultures, customs, peoples, religions disappear. Violence or assimilation just get lost to history. It happens all the time. All the time. We can find peoples that are no longer with us today. Oh, they might be with us in genetic DNA as there was intermarriage or whatever it may be, but they're not with us today in any recognizable forms of the people that existed that were a member of that tribe. And you got to give it to Judaism. Not only has it experienced like ridiculous amounts of persecution over time. Why? I don't know. That's a different discussion worth its own historical deep dive. But ridiculous amounts of persecution scattered across the globe. And here's a fascinating note as well in that. Didn't even end up speaking a common language. Russian Jews spoke Russian. London Jews spoke English. French Jews spoke French. German Jews spoke German. There was no common identifying language. Now, you think so today, Hebrew, but Hebrew was a dead language. Yes, read in prayers or read in books, but not used for common parlance. No like real usage of Hebrew to talk with one another. And yet, here's this diaspora of Jews across the globe who decides we're going to create, ultimately, a nation state of Israel. We're all going to come from across the globe. We don't speak the same language. We're all going to buy into this idea. We're going to set aside other tribal affiliations. Because look, like Jews in London believed and bought in and assimilated them. British. We're going to leave a lot of that behind. We're going to go and we are going to revive. This is so fascinating. They revived Hebrew. Revived it. Go to Israel today. What are they speaking? Hebrew. Revived a language. This tribe of Judaism, has stood time. You have to admire the resiliency of this tribe. And they go with this sense of belonging, and they begin the process of moving into an area. At first, culturally, at first for self-protection, not necessarily for political Zionism, but ultimately, as it evolves, into buying into this idea of a nation that they would one day call Israel. Now, there were people in Palestine. There's a great debate today about who are Palestinians. There's no such thing as Palestinians. There's no such thing as a state of Palestine. And that's true in the great sense of like seeing the world through the geopolitical nation state prism. But that's not the way the world was. Again, that nation state identity is a historical blip on the radar. There's no such thing as Iraqis. There was no such thing as Jordanians. When the Jews in the 1880s began the process of Zionism and moving to the Middle East, who they encountered were Arabs. Now, there were others, again, very diverse community, Christians, but Christian Arabs. Arabs were and are the primary ethnic group of the Middle East. And Arabs, like Saudi Arabs, Iraqi Arabs, Jordanian Arabs, Syrian Arabs, Arabs lived in what we now know of as Palestine. They lived there. Now, they were tribal in that true sense of the word, tribal. I'm talking about small herders, farmers, Bedouins, low literacy rate, according to Daryl Cooper, under 10%. Low levels of literacy. But they're still a people. And there are people living there. And they had been living there for hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands of years. They're living there. And now they're living amongst a bunch of new people who are colonizing the area. And listen, we want to think of this as like this, Islamic versus Judaism blood feud. But it really isn't the history that I understand. And I say this humbly. It isn't the history that I understand from my deep reading so far. This isn't necessarily, we all want to chalk up wars and violence and to religion. Religion is the source, people say religion is the source. Not really. Not really. It wasn't like Muslims, and there was a lot of different kinds of Muslims at that time. There was Muslims in Turkey, there was Muslims in Arabia, there was Muslims in Persia. It's like Muslims like everyone out, anyone non-Muslim. Like you think of it a little bit like that today, and we're going to talk about why in further episodes of this historical analysis, this 101 of the conflict, this Cliff's Notes of history. No, this is political. This was political. So in the 1880s, when the Jews start showing up in the Middle East, here's what you had geopolitically. You had the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire, but it wasn't like what you think of today. It wasn't Iran. It wasn't Islamist. It wasn't fundamentalist. It was a Muslim empire based out of Turkey, led by Turks, Turkish, Ottoman Empire that extended all throughout the Middle East. Now, if you need to like Google a map, and I don't mean to be patronizing, and I don't also want to take for granted. I talked to my wife about this. She's like, when you start talking about maps in conception and like you're listening on a podcast and there's nothing visual to help. She goes, it's like when I talk to you about dinner reservations, Will, like, which is 100% true. Can we talk about dinner reservations over the next month? No. I mean, I will say yes, but in my heart and my mind, I have 100% committed to no. Everything has turned to white noise. Sure. Yeah. Sounds good. Thursday, October 21st with the Royals? Absolutely. No problem. But I don't mean a word that came out of my mouth. I didn't hear any of it, not a word of it. And I will be surprised on that day when you tell me we have dinner reservations tonight. What? What are you talking about? You committed to this, Will. Remember when we were walking and I told you about it? No, you've never told me about this. So my brain goes to white noise when I talk about dinner reservations with my wife. She said when I try to start drawing mental maps in the air to her through language, not through my eyes, through my ears, she says it all turns to white noise. So I don't mean to be patronizing if I do this, and I don't want to take for granted how you see this. But the Ottoman Empire, if you can picture in your mind the Eastern Mediterranean and Turkey on the northern edge, it starts in Turkey, it wraps around, it covers all of that central area. I'm talking about, and I'm going to name countries here, and I'm going to do it somewhat geographically, right? It comes around, it encompasses Syria, it encompasses Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Iraq, it's Kuwait, it's down into Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen and Oman, and it extends even further east into Persia. And then it comes back around on the other side, around the southern Mediterranean, and the Ottoman Empire came along northern Africa, Egypt, and Libya, and all the way out there to Algeria. I mean, it was huge. The Ottoman Empire was a global force for hundreds of years. But by the time you get to the late 1800s, it's kind of getting a little bit decrepit. And people are starting to question it. Not sure of its long-term stability. Just like any empire, it's on its way down eventually. And then along comes World War I. Well, World War I is where now we begin to draw the lines of all the words we use today. All those countries I just named. The idea of Palestine, the germination of the idea of Israel. No one really talked about the concept of Jordan until after World War I. So here's what happened in World War I. The world is set on its axis. It's fighting. It is Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire who joined those Axis powers against the UK and France and Russia. And that was truly a world war. We think of it on the fronts in Europe, but it was everywhere. It was in North Africa, just like World War II for that matter. But the English, who had been on a colonial project for quite some time, and I'm going to take a quick diversion really quickly here to talk about colonization because it's a big part of this. People see the Jews and see Zionism as colonization. It is. People see the Brits going to India and to Africa and to the Americas as colonization. It is. And colonization, even if you did like a AI or Chat GPT ask of colonization, is now almost akin, not quite as bad, but like if slavery is a 10, colonization is now seen as properly as an 8. And I know that like if your kids are in school, they're probably taught colonization through a negative lens. And colonization had a ton of negativity. Horrible things done in the name of colonization. But colonization, Douglas Murray said this on our podcast, and I think we need to have deeper, more interesting conversations about the idea of colonization. Like Douglas Murray said, it was the ultimate and first anti-racist movement. Like it was the idea that, hey, just because you're a different culture, a different race, a different ethnicity, doesn't mean you can't have the fruits of my culture. You can't participate in my values. You just got to learn them. Like the Brits show up to wherever they go and they're like, hey, we have modern medicine. We have longer lifespans. We have longevity. We have higher literacy rates. These are, universal goods, right? Wouldn't we all agree? And if you adopt a few of our customs, we're going to share these miracles with you and help your civilization. And so, of course, the Brits always put themselves at the top of that hierarchy wherever they went. Of course they did. Tell me a civilization that didn't. Of course the Brits were snobby and arrogant and racist in some ways of seeing themselves as better than everybody else. Tell me a civilization that didn't. Tell me a civilization that didn't see themselves as superior to someone else. If you show me that civilization, I will show you a civilization that wasn't going to last for long because it would have subjected itself quickly to this superior alien civilization. So the Brits go along colonizing, and then when they do, in all of their arrogance, also start setting up what ultimately will be this tinderbox that is the Middle East. So the Brits go into World War I and they need help. They need to win. So they set the Arabs, the Saudi Arabs, we now know of as Saudis. They were a tribe. There's a tribe. Set the Arabs against the Ottomans in the war. They set the Arabs fighting the Ottomans, and the Egyptians for that matter, fighting the Ottomans. But the deal that the English made with the Arabs was, when we're done and we defeat Germany and the Axis, we'll carve up the Ottoman Empire and you will get your Arabian kingdom. This is the stuff of a movie. You know, you've heard of it. This is Lawrence of Arabia, okay? T.E. Lawrence. He goes in, he helps create and organize these Arabian fighters to fight the Ottomans, and this is the promise the Brits have made to the Arabs. At the same time, the Zionist movement had already taken off, and it had been really gaining energy in England. There was a guy named Chaim Weizmann, who helped develop a business that had the chemicals and the necessities for English munitions in World War I. So the Brits were like highly indebted to this man and bought stuff off of him, and he was a Zionist. And so they made deals through Weizmann and others that, like, okay, at the end of this deal, you're going to help us, you're going to continue to support the war effort, and we are going to help you establish the Jewish state. And then they made a third deal with the French. Now, even though the English and the French were on the same side of World War I, you know the long history of it, the Brits and the French. I mean, enemies, rivals, whatever. They were never, necessarily brothers. And the French had colonial interest in northern Arabia. So now we're talking about, Syria. And the French had no interest in giving all this up to the Arabs, no interest in giving up their influence in colonial holdings in Arabia. And so the Brits said, okay, you'll continue to have influence over northern Arabia. They made all three of these promises, none of which could live with each other. I heard a historian say, you could keep two, but not three of these promises. The Brits could honor two, but not all three of these promises. And the two that the Brits chose to honor was the promise to the French and the promise to the Zionists. The Brits made a deal with the French. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where they drew a line in the sand. There's a book called A Line in the Sand. They literally drew a line in the sand. It has no geographic, it makes no sense geographically, no river, no mountains, no nothing. Just a line in the sand, cuts through ethnicities, cuts through tribes, cuts through religious affiliations, cuts through everything. Drew a line in the sand and said, everything north of this line, France, you get to establish influence and directorate over. Whatever these guys want, these Arabs want, they have to answer to you. And below, the Brits will administer. And then, by the way, over there in the west, up against the edge of the Mediterranean, we're going to give that to the Zionists in an agreement that was called the Balfour Agreement, which established the intergovernmental global legitimacy to the Zionist project as a political state. Those that were screwed in this line in the sand deal were the Arabs. And here's how that went down. The French created the nation state of Syria. Then they created the nation state of Lebanon, which was primarily at that time Christian. It is no longer. And then they carved out Jordan, what was called Transjordan, carved out Jordan. Now you got three countries, which don't make any real sense geographically or tribally or amongst its peoples. And the Brits gave more control to the Arabs in their area, where they made Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Now, that's the lay of the land at the end of World War I. That is the beginning of the creation in the Middle East of the nation state. Nation states which make no sense. Nation states which are run by kings. Nation states which are run by kings who answer to European colonial powers. Okay, we're going to jump forward in the next episode of the Will Cain Podcast, but just as a quick teaser, you know what happens, right? I mean, you roughly know what happens. All of those kings and all of those puppets of the European colonials, they get overturned by military coups and military dictatorships. I give you Saddam Hussein in Iraq. I give you Bashar al-Assad, his father, the Assads in Syria. Jordan remained a kingdom, but you see the military dictatorships, the latest of which overthrow is in Iran later down the line in the 1970s, where you have an overthrow, a coup of the European supposed colonialist puppet kings of that time. But that's the lay of the land at the end of World War I. But in that process, what you have now, when it comes to this particular part of the world, Israel and Palestine, is a group of Arab people, tribal people who'd been in that area for millennia, now inside of an area where they outnumber Jews greatly, who are all of a sudden isolated from the rest of Arabia, all of a sudden now living in a land where people are immigrating to their land and at first saying, we just want to live, culturally Zionist amongst you, and beginning to now talk in more political terms, and you're starting to get confrontations. Beginning in the 1920s now, you begin to get some of the more, there had been violent confrontations before, but you start to see the ramp up to what will happen over the next 25, 30 years, which is what we will cover in the next historical. We're going to do this in 3 parts. The second part, we will cover 1920 to essentially 1948, the official creation of the State of Israel. And then our third part will take that to present, talking about the wars in the Middle East and the constant conflicts between Palestine and Israel from 1948 forward. But that is the deep historical history that sets the foundation for not just the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the concept of a state, of a nation, in a land full of tribes. It is the big takeaway, the understanding. I told you, the point of this, I think, is understanding. And I think that the understanding that I come away from this with is we as people, humanity, this doesn't endorse it. It doesn't say it's the way we should live, but it is part of our DNA. We are tribal. We organize tribes by family. We organize tribes by ethnicity. We organize tribes by religion. We evolved beyond that by buying into the concept of the nation state, which has a greater goal, a greater ideal. I think the most perfect example of that, the most successful example of that in human history is the United States of America. And that is why this country is so worthy to fight for. But amidst that environment, you have now a colonization effort evolving into a nation state with an isolated people who've lived there for millennia, who are being told, hey, these guys used to live here, so you guys need to acquiesce. And the beginning then of how that erupts into violent conflict. I'll leave you with this. Because I believe this is such a unique experiment in human history, the United States of America, where we bought into what I think, I really truly do, wise and reasoned and historically grounded ideals to buy into. We didn't just buy into any willy-nilly crap about seeing ourselves through a class divide or some modern new ideology like communism. Like that's a modern thing they asked people to buy into and still do. They asked people to stop seeing themselves as tribes and begin to see themselves as classes. We're here, we ask people to buy into values and ideas. That's our common bind. Our culture, which is just an accumulation of values. Our ideas, our principles that were grounded in the roots of Western civilization, Judeo-Christian ethics, Enlightenment values, Greek philosophy. Not fly-by-the-night stuff. Stand the test of thousands of years of time. And we did, and we bought into it. So what I believe, when we see red, white, and blue, why I have a problem when people kneel on a football field in front of that flag, why I say that the sins of our forebears are not what define us, but our ability to live up to these ideals. When I say all that, this is why this experiment is unique in human history. And for me, that's why I ask in any potential global conflict like we sit at now, and I want to understand, I come back to that understanding is rooted in protecting this unique little blip on the radar of civilization. This little blip on this small deviation from the base instinct of man. The United States of America. Story number 3. Hey, it turns out we have 2 of America's teams in DFW. The Dallas Cowboys beat the Los Angeles Chargers on Monday Night Football, but it was really, honestly, a side dish for my sports consumption this week. I will say this about the Cowboys beating the Chargers. 2 quick takeaways. I'm evolving into this confirmed position and evolving away from a previous confirmed position. I'm evolving into, 1, Mike McCarthy is a bad coach, okay? And it's grounded in 2 things. And I have been a McCarthy defender and supporter. And I'm not all the way out, but the door is beginning to shut. Mike McCarthy had 8 seconds left and 2 timeouts. It took what appeared to be a timeout as the Cowboys sat at the end of the first half on about the 15-yard line. He took a timeout with 8 seconds left, which gives you time to take a shot into the end zone for a touchdown, okay? And then if you don't get it or something bad happens, you have another timeout to call so you can get your field goal unit out there. It's bang, bang. You got to do it quick, but that's the way you play if you want to win the game. It appeared he called a timeout with 8 seconds left. He apparently went to the referee and said, I meant to let that clock run down to 3 and then have my timeout taken. The refs obliged. The Cowboys kicked a field goal, never took a shot to the end zone, and went home at halftime with an extra timeout in their pocket. Smart thinking there, Mikey boy. Now we have 4 timeouts in the second half. Of course, you know that's not how it works. Timeouts don't roll over. You don't bank them. They're not like savings. You have to use all 3 in the first half or the second half, and they don't roll over to the next game. So he was too scared to take a shot into the end zone. Too scared to try to win the game. No, I'm good. Let the clock run down. We'll kick for 3. Which brings me to the second takeaway, a position I'm evolving away from. I've been very hard on and down on Dak, okay? And a lot of you are like, no, you haven't, Will. You're a complete homer and you're in the tank. Well, as of late and as of recently, I've started to reconcile myself to the fact that he may not be the guy that takes us to the promised land, okay, after that beat down by the 49ers. But there is a level or there is a reality in the middle. Dak is a really, really good quarterback. Dak's a top 10 quarterback. I'm sorry, but that is indisputable. That doesn't mean Dak is a quarterback that gets you to the Super Bowl. I'm still unconvinced. But if anyone ever pays attention to the numbers or watches a game, Dak was awesome against the Chargers. That's the truth. He takes too many sacks. I agree. I didn't say he's perfect, but Dak was awesome against the Chargers. And not for nothing, but the Philadelphia Eagles and their universally celebrated quarterback, Jalen Hurts, just lost to the New York Jets, which sent people on the pathway of going, look at all the quarterbacks that have lost to the New York Jets. Look at the defenses that have shut down the great quarterbacks of the NFL. And it's like all of them. But not Dak. Dak dominated the defense of the New York Jets. Now, yes, the defense scored touchdowns and all that, but Dak was awesome against the New York Jets. He was not good against the San Francisco 49ers. And I think, to tie these 2 points together, this offense by Mike McCarthy is putrid. It's trash, and it's not doing Dak any good service. What is the Cowboys' offense? What is it? What's the identity? They don't run the ball well. They don't take deep shots. It's like 6-yard outs. Get the ball out quick, Dak. It's trash. Now, people say, oh, the West Coast offense takes time to adjust to. Always better in the second year. And the Texas Coast offense under Mike. Look, man, he's been the coach for a while. I don't care if he's just been the offensive coordinator this year. This offense is garbage. And Dak deserves an excuse for having to operate in this offense. It doesn't make Dak, as I have often said, a top 5 quarterback. No, I don't think that he is. I'm not sure Dak is a Super Bowl level quarterback. But I'm going to tell you this. Dak is damn good. He is a top 10 quarterback. And now to America's second team, the Texas Rangers. Is there anything better than playoff baseball? Is there anything better than bases loaded, no outs, jam where you get out with 0? I'm telling you, the tension on a playoff pitch rivals playoff hockey. It's so awesome. It's been so long since I experienced it. I love it. I love it. This is amazing to see the Texas Rangers up 2-0 as this is published in the ALCS against the Houston Astros. And I got to tell you, I've missed playoff baseball. Now, you got to have a vested interest. You really do. You got to have a vested interest. You got to care. You can't watch 2 teams you don't care about, and I get that, but I care. I've cared since the 1980s. I've been there through Ruben Sierra and Juan Gonzalez and Rafael Palmeiro. I've been there through Josh Hamilton and the down years when we lost 94 games. I'm here now, and let me tell you something. As Max Scherzer takes the mound, I can't wait for the tension of every little play in playoff baseball. Why are the Rangers America's team? Easy. Because everybody hates the Astros. Everybody in America rooting for the Texas Rangers. That's going to do it for me today. I will see you again next time right here. Give me feedback, Will Cain Podcast at fox.com. See you next time. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.